Hey guys, today we're diving into another truly horrifying case. If you want to support my channel, make sure to subscribe and stay active. It really helps me out. I'd be super grateful for that. Let's get started. Scientists agree that aggressive behavior in teens isn't something they're born with or inherit. It's shaped by their surroundings, the way they're raised, and the quality of their relationships with adults. This doesn't apply to diagnosed mental health conditions, of course, but it's crucial to remember that every person, no matter their age, needs love, support, care, and understanding. Emotional and physical mistreatment can sometimes push someone to a very dark place, even turn them into someone capable of terrifying actions. The case of the Hallowell family is unusually complex and far from typical in every way. At first glance, they seemed like an average household, nothing out of the ordinary. Their co-workers and neighbors couldn't say a bad word about them. But somehow, trouble seemed to follow them. Strange, sometimes downright disturbing. Things happened around this family. When the mother was found lifeless in their home under chilling and suspicious circumstances, attention quickly turned to her sons. As detectives dug deeper into the case, they began to uncover a string of unsettling family secrets, the kind that painted a very different picture of the quiet, seemingly normal life the Hallowells had appeared to lead. For several generations, the Hallowell family lived in a small town in Marin County, nestled in the southwestern part of California. They weren't wealthy by any means, but they did own a spacious two-story home in the unincorporated community of Inverness, right along the scenic shores of Lake Cedro. The property had been in the family since the mid-1950s, meaning 3 generations had lived under that same roof. It's worth noting that only about 15 homes sat along that lake, and the residents had lived side by side for many years. This created a tight-knit, close community where everyone knew each other well. Crime was virtually non-existent, and strangers were a rare sight. The area was surrounded by lush greenery, making it feel almost like a hidden paradise. In 1965, after many years of unsuccessful attempts to become parents, the Hallowell couple made the decision to adopt a baby girl whose biological parents had given up their rights. She was just 3 months old when they brought her home and gave her the name Denise. From that moment on, she became the center of their universe. She was raised in an environment full of love and care, received a strong education, and had the freedom to pursue her biggest passion: extreme sports. At the age of 20, still a college student, Denise got married for the first time to a fellow student named Richard. The two shared a love for skydiving, and in fact, on the day of their wedding, the couple and their witnesses did a group jump. During freefall, Denise and Richard exchanged rings mid-air, but the excitement of their adventurous lifestyle couldn't hold their relationship together. Like many young couples, they simply weren't ready for the realities of married life, the everyday struggles and compromises. They divorced 2 years after their wedding and eventually lost all contact with each other. In 1998, at 33, Denise got married for the second time. This time, her partner was Benjamin, who was nearly a decade older. The couple hoped to start a family, but Denise was diagnosed with health complications that made pregnancy impossible. Rather than give up on becoming parents, they took a less traditional route. Inspired by Hollywood star Angelina Jolie in 2006, the then 41-year-old Denise and 51-year-old Benjamin adopted a boy named Carlos. He had just turned 4, was originally from Guatemala, and the adoption process had been both costly and challenging. A year later, they adopted another boy, Angel, from Honduras. Another complicated, expensive process that demanded a lot from the couple emotionally and financially. Despite now having 2 sons, Denise and Benjamin's marriage continued to strain. In 2012, they made the decision to separate. After the divorce, the boys remained with Denise, while Benjamin moved to another state. He never stayed in touch and showed no further interest in the boys' lives. By the time Denise's adoptive parents had passed, she inherited the lakefront home on Lake Cedro and made the decision to move there with her sons. She worked as a middle school teacher in Marin County, a modest job that didn't bring in much money, but it seemed to be enough to get by. People who knew her described her as educated, intelligent, and non-confrontational. She was respected at work, and neighbors had nothing negative to say about her. Raising 2 adopted sons on her own proved to be incredibly difficult for Denise. Without a father figure in the picture, the boys began to spiral, and she struggled to keep them in line. Angel, in particular, caused the most concern. Even in elementary school, he refused to follow rules or listen to authority. He often had explosive outbursts and episodes of intense aggression. This wasn't typical mischief or rebellion. Angel would lash out at other students, and his behavior was sometimes so extreme that it posed a real danger to both himself and others. Carlos had his own issues, though his behavior was less overt. He was more withdrawn and didn't pick fights openly, but if he sensed a confrontation coming, he wouldn't hesitate to throw the first punch. Carlos struggled to make connections with peers and had very few friends, but he found some solace in athletic activities. The brothers never got along. Despite growing up in the same home for years, they didn't bond. In fact, they were openly hostile toward each other. Their fights were brutal and frequent, and it was clear they harbored deep resentment. Still, Denise didn't seem to view this as a serious problem. She never sought outside help or involved any professionals. By the time Angel was around 9 or 10 years old, things had taken a turn for the worse. He began skipping school regularly, and teachers reported repeated incidents of aggression. He also started stealing. Around the same time, he ran away from home for the first time, disappearing for several days before returning. After that, it became a pattern. He would vanish for days at a time and stopped attending school altogether. In September 2016, officials from Child Welfare Services paid a visit to the Hallowell residence following ongoing complaints from teachers about the boy's behavior and Angel's repeated disappearances. Their goal was to check on the home environment and speak with the family directly, but what they found was unsettling. Denise was home with the boys and clearly wasn't expecting any visitors. Still, she allowed the officer and child protection worker inside, as she had no legal reason to deny them entry. One of the first things that stood out was the condition of the windows. The lower floor windows were partially covered from the inside with cardboard, making it impossible to see what was going on inside from the outside. Inside the house where Denise lived with her 2 sons, something felt off from the very beginning. There were no signs of typical hobbies or pastimes one might expect. No toys, no bikes, no rollerblades. The place was almost barren, with only the most basic furniture, all of it left over from her late parents. The kitchen had an old refrigerator and a worn-out washing machine. Denise had a bed in her own room, but her sons were sleeping on inflatable mattresses tossed directly onto the floor. The most shocking discovery, however, came when officials inspected Angel's room. It didn't resemble a typical bedroom at all. It looked more like solitary confinement. The heavy wooden door had not only a basic turn lock on the inside, but also a large metal bolt installed on the outside. There was a small hatch built into the door, which could be locked as well, apparently used to pass food and water inside without opening the door completely. The room was dimly lit. The windows had been fully covered with cardboard, blocking out all natural light. In the corner, Angel sat quietly on a worn-out mattress. In the opposite corner stood a foul-smelling plastic bucket, about 1/3 full of human waste. The stench matched the conditions. Angel, however, wasn't scared. He seemed angry. All 3, Denise and her 2 sons, were immediately taken to the local police station. A child psychologist spoke with the boys, while Denise was questioned about the disturbing situation at home. She explained that locking Angel in the room was something she did for safety reasons, to prevent the brothers from fighting, and to keep the younger one from running away again. Her explanation didn't sit well with the officers, especially once Angel began to describe his side of the story. He claimed that Carlos frequently hit him, humiliated him, and even threatened to end his life. Their mother, according to Angel, never stepped in or defended him. Feeling unsafe, he had tried running away several times. After each escape, Denise began locking him in the room, sometimes for days at a time. He said he had no access to a real bathroom and was given only a plastic bucket to relieve himself. Food and water were passed through the small window in the door, which otherwise stayed locked. Following this testimony, Denise was placed under arrest. Authorities decided to temporarily place both boys in protective care while searching for new adoptive families. A judge was expected to determine what would happen next. But then, something unexpected happened. Carlos began defending his adoptive mother. According to Carlos, his younger brother posed a serious risk, not only to himself, but to everyone around him. No one seemed capable of managing Angel's behavior, and their mom, he said, was simply doing what she could to keep everyone safe. Carlos shared that at one point, Angel had brought a knife to school and came dangerously close to harming a classmate. Thankfully, no one was hurt. His account was later confirmed by school staff, who admitted they had covered up the incident at the request of the classmate's parent, who also worked at the school. Carlos continued to defend his adoptive mother passionately, insisting he wanted to go back home and live with her just like before. During every hearing, he stood by Denise and pleaded with the court not to strip her of her parental rights. Other witnesses, including relatives and neighbors, couldn't offer much insight. They all described the Hallowells as a decent family and considered Denise a caring and responsible parent. Eventually, the case seemed to lean in her favor. Denise didn't appear to be guilty of any wrongdoing. It looked more like she was simply overwhelmed and unable to cope with her younger son's deeply troubling behavior. Angel was eventually placed in a psychiatric facility, then transferred to a group home for high-risk youths, and later placed with a new adoptive family. Denise was fully cleared of all accusations and reinstated as Carlos's legal guardian. As he had hoped, Carlos returned to the lake house and resumed what seemed like a normal life. On the evening of July 13th, 2019, around 6 p.m., a panicked teenager called Marin County Emergency Services, reporting that his mother had been attacked. The 17-year-old was distraught, pleading for officers and paramedics to arrive quickly. He waited for them at the end of the driveway. Carlos led responders into his mother's bedroom, and what they saw was horrifying. Denise was lying on her side on the bed, and lodged in the back of her head was an axe. Blood had soaked through the pillow, creating a massive red stain. When first responders arrived, she was still showing faint signs of life, but despite their efforts, she passed away en route to the hospital. Carlos was the only witness to the incident and gave a story that raised more questions than answers. He claimed that earlier that day, he and his mom had attended a relative's funeral in a neighboring town, followed by a memorial meal. They returned home around 4:30 p.m., both exhausted, and decided to lie down for a rest. Carlos said he quickly fell asleep. About an hour later, around 6 p.m., he woke up to strange noises and the sound of the dogs barking. Looking out the window, he noticed that the gate to the dog run was open and their dogs were running loose in the yard. Concerned, he went to check on his mom, and that's when he discovered the horrifying scene. He immediately contacted emergency services, hoping she could still be helped. When investigators asked Carlos who might have had a reason to hurt his mother, he didn't hesitate. He named Angel. According to him, only his younger brother harbored enough anger and resentment toward Denise to actually want to harm her. Carlos also admitted that he believed Angel was capable of hurting him too, but for some unknown reason, didn't follow through. He added that he no longer felt safe and feared what might happen next. After speaking with Carlos, authorities moved quickly to locate and question Angel, who was now considered the primary suspect. But that proved to be more difficult than expected. No one seemed to know where the 15-year-old was. Since being removed from the Hallowell household by Child Welfare Services, Angel had cycled through several foster homes, but never managed to settle anywhere. He struggled with social interaction, couldn't get along with others, displayed ongoing aggression, and frequently ran away. About a year before the incident, Angel had run away from yet another foster home, and this time, he completely vanished. His whereabouts remained unknown, and now investigators feared he may have returned to carry out an act of revenge against the woman with whom he had always had a difficult and volatile relationship. There were a number of troubling details at the scene that seemed to support that theory. There were no signs of forced entry. Angel had always gotten along better with the dogs than with people, so it wasn't surprising that they didn't raise alarm. The weapon used in the attack, an axe, was taken from the backyard. Nothing was stolen from the house. In fact, cash and a debit card were still sitting untouched on the nightstand next to Denise. That meant the motive wasn't robbery. Whoever did this had a personal reason, and it looked like Denise had been deliberately targeted. Authorities canvassed the neighborhood along Lake Cedro, hoping for leads. But most neighbors had little to offer. No one could say anything negative about the Hallowell family. In fact, people described Denise as calm, well-spoken, and thoughtful. While she and the boys hadn't lived there long, her late parents had been familiar faces in the community. But then, some residents began to recall strange and troubling events that started shortly after Denise and her sons moved into the lake house. Local pets had begun disappearing, first a few cats, then dogs. Some of these animals were later found in remote corners of the area, badly mutilated. At first, folks chalked it up to wild animal attacks, but the condition of the remains suggested otherwise. It was too intentional, too gruesome. People began to fear that someone, possibly a disturbed individual, was behind it. And whoever it was, they seemed to be operating frighteningly close to home. Soon after the initial wave of missing pets, things in the area escalated. Residents began reporting the disappearance of young livestock, baby goats, foals, and other small animals. When these animals were found, the scene was deeply disturbing. Many had suffered what appeared to be intentional harm, deep slashes, torn wounds, and in some cases, severe disfigurement. Their eyes had been damaged, and the injuries suggested deliberate cruelty. Several locals reported these incidents to law enforcement, but it seemed like the cases weren't prioritized. Officers appeared to have more pressing matters than investigating harm to animals and missing pets. Interestingly, no one ever connected these gruesome acts with the Hallowell family. In fact, Denise and her sons had even helped search for some of the missing pets. She spoke with neighbors regularly, though she wasn't particularly close with anyone and rarely had visitors at her home. Most people didn't know much about what was going on behind closed doors. Many weren't even aware that Angel had been placed with a different adoptive family. They assumed he had gone to live with relatives in town, just like Carlos had during a previous stretch. The detail about Carlos having lived elsewhere for a time caught the attention of investigators. They decided to dig deeper and reached out to the relatives who had taken him in, hoping to understand what led to that arrangement. As it turned out, Carlos had also experienced serious behavioral challenges, though most people around him had no idea. At 14, he started drinking alcohol and experimenting with various banned substances. His behavior became erratic and volatile. He would lash out, even toward his mother and younger brother. Denise eventually sought professional help. That's when Carlos was diagnosed with bipolar disorder and signs of obsessive-compulsive tendencies. These symptoms were reportedly made worse by his use of alcohol and psychoactive substances. He spent a short time in a treatment facility, but was later discharged with a prescription for medication, which he refused to take and ended up throwing away. At 16, Carlos stopped attending school but managed to keep that fact hidden from his mother for a while. He pretended to leave for class each morning, even though he wasn't enrolled anymore. When Denise finally found out, it led to a major confrontation. Not long after, Carlos consumed a dangerous mix of painkillers and alcohol, a combination that nearly cost him his life. Denise called emergency services just in time, and medical staff were able to stabilize him. After that terrifying episode, a relative named Stephanie offered to step in and help. Her own son had once struggled with similar issues, including bipolar disorder and behavioral instability, during his teen years. Stephanie had done extensive reading on the subject and tried various therapeutic methods at home. Over time, her son seemed to grow out of that difficult period. He matured, went on to get an education, and eventually moved to another city to live a stable life. Stephanie was completely convinced that it was her approach, her own version of therapy, that had helped her son recover. She believed herself to be a self-taught expert in mental health, even though she had no formal training and relied solely on online advice and various books. Confident in her methods, she decided to try the same approach with her relative's son and suggested that Carlos move into her home temporarily for what she referred to as treatment. Carlos ended up living at Stephanie's house for about 6 months. During that time, Denise would visit him regularly, and Stephanie conducted what she called therapy sessions. She suggested recording these sessions on tape so they could later be reviewed and analyzed for progress. All the recordings were stored in her home, and after the tragedy involving Denise, those tapes became critical evidence. What the tapes revealed painted a deeply troubling picture of the relationship between Denise and Carlos. Their interactions were far from nurturing. Denise frequently blamed him for everything that had gone wrong in her life. She openly expressed regret over adopting him, calling him names, saying he was unwanted, and that no one would ever love him. During this same period, Denise was also facing serious financial hardship. She had lost her teaching job and was scraping by with occasional, unstable side gigs. She began pressuring Carlos to find work and help cover household expenses. At one point, she stopped buying him clothes, claiming she couldn't afford it. Eventually, she even refused to feed him, telling him that if he wanted to eat, he'd have to buy his own food. Things deteriorated further. Denise resorted to verbal abuse, referencing the circumstances of his adoption in cruel terms. She would say things like she and her husband picked him up off the streets, and that without her, he would have already wasted away from hunger or illness in some rundown neighborhood. She made offensive, racially charged comments, reminded him of how much the adoption process had cost her, and even demanded that he repay those expenses. Yet, despite all of this, about a month before the tragedy, Carlos expressed a desire to move back in with his adoptive mother. At Stephanie's suggestion, he even made a list of reasons why he wanted to return. One of the top reasons was his hope to repair the relationship. Denise, for her part, supported his goal of going to college. She believed that education was a crucial part of his future and had promised to help with tuition costs if she could. Stephanie encouraged Denise to install surveillance cameras in several rooms of the house, specifically the areas where she and Carlos interacted most, so that Stephanie could continue monitoring the teen's behavior remotely. The idea sounded strange, but Denise agreed, partly as a precaution. It was clear she didn't fully trust Carlos, and feared that in a moment of anger, he might lose control. Interestingly, those same cameras, along with Denise's phone, mysteriously disappeared from the house. The surveillance system had been deactivated the day before the incident. Carlos claimed he had nothing to do with it. According to him, Denise handled all of that herself. As for the phone, he said he hadn't seen it and had no idea where it might be. A week before the tragedy, another intense argument broke out between Denise and Carlos, one that escalated into a physical altercation. A neighbor happened to witness the incident and intervened. He warned them that if something like that happened again, he wouldn't hesitate to call the police. After Denise's death, Carlos was immediately considered a person of interest. However, there wasn't enough concrete evidence to formally charge him at that point. Authorities interviewed him, but ultimately released him. At that time, the primary suspect remained his missing brother, Angel. The day after the incident, a local teen, a neighbor and friend of Carlos, stopped by to offer his condolences. They were around the same age and had a casual friendship. But Carlos didn't appear visibly upset. Instead, he told the boy that all he needed to do was make it through the next 3 weeks until his 18th birthday. After that, he said, he'd sell this cursed house of horrors and leave the area for good. His friend was taken aback by both the words and the unnerving calmness with which they were delivered. He shared the exchange with his parents, who in turn contacted the police. This prompted authorities to bring Carlos in for another round of questioning, but he didn't offer any new information. Investigators decided to bring in a dive team to search the lake behind the Hallowell property, suspecting that the missing cameras and Denise's phone may have been dumped there. The lake wasn't especially large, and it didn't take long for them to locate the items. Unfortunately, the cameras were useless. They had been turned off before the incident and contained no recorded footage. However, the phone told a different story. Data revealed it had been powered down, likely after hitting the water, just 10 minutes before Carlos made the call to emergency services. Even more telling, Denise had been actively messaging a friend on social media only 15 minutes prior to that. This allowed investigators to pinpoint the approximate time of the attack with a high level of accuracy. Carlos had insisted he'd been asleep during that time and had only woken up when he heard the dogs barking outside. But analysis of his own phone usage painted a different picture. His device had been active shortly before Denise was attacked. Additionally, a nearby neighbor told police he had seen Carlos outside around 5:30 p.m., walking toward the backyard shed. When confronted with this evidence, including the neighbor's statement, Carlos started to backtrack and became inconsistent in his responses. Eventually, he admitted that he had, in fact, gone outside around that time. He claimed he was splitting firewood behind the house to blow off steam after an argument with his mom. At one point, Carlos said he went back inside the house to get a glass of water. He sat in the kitchen for about 5 minutes, and that's when he heard the dogs barking. He stepped outside, but didn't see anyone who might have let them out. Thinking it might have been his mother, he headed to her bedroom, and that's when he discovered her lying on the bed with an axe embedded in the back of her head. Carlos continued to insist he was innocent, maintaining that his runaway younger brother, Angel, was the real culprit. His attorney built a defense strategy around this version of events. Since there was no physical evidence directly linking Carlos to the crime, and because Angel was still missing, investigators had no choice but to keep him listed as a possible suspect. A major turning point in the case came in early 2020 when authorities finally tracked down Angel. He had been living in another state, held in a juvenile detention facility after being arrested for a break-in. Because he had used a false identity, it had taken time to confirm who he really was. Records showed that at the time of the crime, Angel was already in custody, meaning he couldn't have been involved in what happened to Denise. He was brought back to California to testify in court. On the stand, Angel described his brother as someone deeply troubled, someone who had tormented both him and their adoptive mother. He also claimed Carlos was responsible for the disturbing cases of animal cruelty that had plagued the neighborhood. Faced with mounting evidence and no way to redirect blame, Carlos eventually agreed to a plea deal and admitted responsibility for the crime. However, when pressed on his motive, he struggled to give a clear answer. He simply said he hated his mother, dreamed of selling the house, and wanted to leave everything behind. He said the idea just came to him while chopping firewood. This explanation was used in an attempt to frame the act as unplanned, a spontaneous outburst, rather than premeditated violence. Carlos even claimed he had experienced a temporary mental breakdown. But the fact that the surveillance cameras had been turned off in advance and later removed from the house painted a different picture, one that suggested careful preparation. In March 2021, Carlos was found guilty of the deliberate and intentional killing of his adoptive mother. He was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. However, because he was a minor at the time of the crime, the court granted him the right to a sentence review in the year 2041. Thanks for watching, everyone. Your support means a lot to me, and you can help my channel grow by hitting that like button, dropping a comment, and sharing this video. Your engagement really makes a difference. See you soon.